Hello there, friends. Welcome back to the Vaults Remastered. Today, we're going to continue with our dive into Pathfinder basic training. We're on episode 11 of this mini series, Action 11, and that one is actually two actions. I lied. It's the step action and the stride action because they're kind of the same thing. You're moving your character in a direction. Step is you move a single step, which would be 5 feet. Stride is you move up to whatever your movement speed is, your land speed. Now, as far as stepping goes, you have to have at least a 10-foot movement speed, so that's your requirement there. It says that you carefully move 5 feet, and unlike most types of movement, stepping doesn't trigger reactions. So let's say you're right next to an enemy and you want to move away from them, you can use the step reaction, or sorry, the step action that will avoid a reactive strike from them, so they can't just wail on you or any other sort of action that would be triggered by movements. You can't step into difficult terrain, however, and we're going to take a look at why that is in a second. And you can't step using a speed other than your land speed. So you can't step if you're swimming or using a swim speed or a fly speed. I would assume that might fall under a different style of movement or different action, but you can't use the step action to avoid, I guess, the reactive strikes. And then stride is stepping, but you're moving up to 25, 30 feet, depending on what your move speed is. Most ancestries, most characters have a 25-foot move speed. A couple have 30 and a couple have 20. So you can move up to that distance. Other than that, there's really nothing to these two actions, although we are going to take a look at some adjudication considerations. So let's see here. The first one, player core, page 420. There are different movement types. I've mentioned a couple: swimming, flying, climbing, whatever, burrowing speeds. And what it says here on that page of the player core is that switching from one movement type to another requires ending your action that has the first movement type and using a new action that has the second movement type. So if you're going to go from, running and then getting into water and swimming, that's technically two different actions, the way this reads. Now, I might not agree with that a little bit because I have a character in my one game that actually has a climb speed because they're one of my weavelings, one of my homebrew. If you haven't seen my weaveling video, you need to like, you need to subscribe, you need to look at the channel. I've got lots of other videos out there, and one of them is this homebrewed ancestry known as the weaveling. It's a derivative of the chitines, the spider folk of D&D. But anyway, they have a climb speed, and for that particular character, it's come up a couple times now where he's moving across the ground and then wants to scurry up some wall or whatever. And the questions come up, is this one action or two actions? And I've kind of left it mostly as it's a single action, which actually jives with what it says here in the entry, because it goes on to say, in some cases, the GM might rule otherwise, especially if you're moving a very short distance using one of the types of movement. So in the scenarios that I've seen, he's moved, let's say, 10, 15 feet, got to a wall, and then wants to start to scurry up. So in that case, as a spidery creature, I don't see why that would be two distinct actions. Now, I have said also that, well, it depends on what you're climbing up. If it's going to be something that's a difficult terrain or whatever to climb up, jagged spikes or something sticking out, well, then, yeah, maybe it would take more time and other extra action because you have to be more athletics, that kind of thing. Normally, if you have a climb speed, you don't need to do an athletics check. You just climb. But if it's something that would, qualify as difficult climbing, then yeah, you could have an athletics check. You could just charge that extra action. And I would say the same thing with a swim speed. If you're, running across the dock or whatever and jump into the water and start swimming, why is that two actions? It doesn't seem like that makes sense to me. Now, if you're slowly, sitting down in the water and then start swimming because the water's cold, yeah, then that's two actions. But I think it really depends on the situation. So I do like that they've put in here that it's kind of up to the GM how to rule on that one. And I might throw out fly as another one. Let's say you're standing at a ledge and you run and dive off and start to glide or fly again. That shouldn't be, one action in my opinion. Now, exactly when you would split the movement, though, that's where I think the gray area might be. Because let's say your ground speed is 20 feet, your fly speed is 40, and you only move 5 feet to get to the edge of the ledge and dive off. Does that mean you still have 35 feet of movement? I would argue that's going to be more of a proportion base. So if I've moved 5 out of 20 to get to the edge, that's a quarter. then I would say I've used a quarter of my movement, so I'd only have a 3/4 of my flight speed. So in my example, you could fly 30 feet, not 35. That's the way I would rule it. But your mileage may vary. And of course, if you disagree or run into a similar situation, you can go ahead and put your comments down below. All right, continuing on here, the other stuff that's interesting here is moving through creature space. This is probably common sense to most people. But one thing is that you can move through a willing creature's space, so they have to be willing, and you can move through it, and it doesn't technically cost you anything extra. Typically, when I was running D&D 5e, I would say, yeah, you can move through your allies' space, but it costs you, like difficult terrain, it's an extra 5 feet. And I probably still think that way now. I'm not sure I would just make it free because you got to get through the person, right? So it's going to slow you down a little bit, I would say. But then it goes on to say if you want to move through an unwilling creature's space, you have the option to use the tumble through, which is an acrobatics based skill action. I haven't looked at any of these yet, but you use your d20, roll using your acrobatics, and if you're successful, it's probably being opposed by maybe a fortitude save or a fortitude DC. I'm not 100% sure, but you're able to get through. I don't know if there's a way to use athletics, maybe the shove. I think there's a shove action. So you're not really going through somebody, though. You're pushing them out of the spot. So this would be to go through them. Acrobatics tumble through. The other thing it says, you can't end your turn in a square that's occupied by another creature. That should make sense. Though you can end a move action in its square, provided that you immediately use another move action to leave that square. So I think this would apply to allies more than enemies, because if you're moving through a enemy's space, then... Sorry, the puppies got excited because the wind just gusted and blew something over outside. But anyways, I was saying that you can get through an enemy's space, but you can't end your movement in there. And if you do end your movement in there, you have to move immediately to keep going. So if this was your last action, try to tumble through or move through some ally and you end up in their space or whatever, you can't. It can't be your last action. You have to be able to move it again and get out of there. It also says if two creatures end up in the same square by accident, the GM gets to decide who gets pushed out, who maybe gets knocked prone. And this is actually something that goes back to my crawl action video, where you can crawl through an occupied space because you're prone and remain within that same space. Although I think maybe the enemies can stop you, of course. But that's just some things to consider, a sort of order of operations here. If you are trying to get through another person's space, you can't just stop there. You have to move again. So if you did have another action you wanted to use to attack, it would have to be after you've gotten free of that occupied space. All right, then the last thing here is the difficult terrain. And this is something else interesting that came up during, I think it was also in my crawl video. So it says here, difficult terrain is any terrain that impedes your movement, so rough terrain, unstable surface, whatever, right? Moving into a square of difficult terrain or moving, I think this is redundant here, or moving 5 feet into, I think it should just be or moving within the area of difficult terrain. So you either move into it or you're moving through it. It costs you an extra 5 feet of movement. So moving into a square or moving within the area of difficult terrain costs an extra 5 feet. So a couple questions I have here. Is it only one time it's costing you? So I move in, it costs me 5. Or moving 5 feet, I'm guessing the 5 feet in the terrain is then another 5. So I think what it's translating is that you're moving at half speed. I think you have to pay the 5 feet each time you move. That's what that kind of makes sense, right? Then it goes on to say that moving into greater difficult terrain, so really bad terrain, that's going to cost you an extra 10 feet of movement. And then here's the other interesting thing that I didn't see when I was doing my crawl video, because this was one of the questions I had. If you're crawling through difficult terrain, crawling diagonally, how that power, that action really robs you of doing anything else. And I was hypothesizing a couple scenarios where it's difficult terrain or diagonal movement. It says here that this additional cost is not increased further when moving diagonally. So if you are moving diagonally through difficult terrain, you don't get charged that extra diagonal movement penalty. So that's one thing. So if you are crawling diagonally, you're not going to get charged for that movement diagonal. And then the other thing you want to be aware of is that stepping, you cannot step into difficult terrain because the act of entering difficult terrain costs you an extra 5. So it's technically 10 feet, and the step action is only 5 feet. So you can't step into difficult terrain. And does that mean you can't step out of difficult terrain? I don't think that's the case because it says if you move into the square or you're moving within the difficult terrain, that's where the penalty is. But if you're stepping out, it sounds like you're not being penalized. That's my take on it. So as long as you're leaving the difficult terrain, you don't get penalized the extra 5 feet, and you can take the step action. At least that's the way I understand this here. All right, well, there you go. That is my take on these two actions, step and stride. Pretty much the same thing, pretty simple. The only thing you got to worry about is difficult terrain, some of the diagonal movement stuff, and then you have to adjudicate the issue of different movement types. And I think that's going to be just, sort of your common sense and what you think is fair as a GM in circumstances where a player has different movement types. Now, if a player does not have, and I'll just one thing I will clarify, if a player does not have a climb speed or a swim speed or whatever it is, then yeah, I would charge them that extra action because the action of climbing without a climb speed is not as easy as you just have a insectoid body and you're climbing up. So that's where I would differentiate that. Or am I an amphibious creature with a swim speed? I just jump into the water. I don't see why I would have to take the swim action because I have a swim speed. All right, well, there you go. That's what I have to say. So hopefully there was something interesting, entertaining, useful information here. Go ahead and like, subscribe, notify yourself, all those cool things for YouTube and the algorithm, and let me know that you're interested in seeing more of these types of training videos. Once I get done with this set, I think I'm going to go back and get into some of the more meaty stuff, lore and those types of things. All right, have yourself a good night.